Good afternoon. I'm Robin Achilles, and I'm the Philanthropy Associate here at the Community Library. Thank you for joining us here today for our panel discussion, which is part of a 2-month winter read programming, which centers around the Japanese-American incarceration during World War II and the novel Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet by Jamie Ford. We would like to thank our sponsors, the Spur Foundation and Carlin Ring, as well as our community partners, the National Park Service, Friends of Minidoka, Sun Valley Community School, Wood River High School, the WOW Generosity Project, and the Haley Public Library for their support and participation. The program today holds deep meaning to me. During World War II, both of my parents and their families were forcibly removed from their homes in California. They were incarcerated in concentration camps, labeled as enemies, despite being American citizens. Stripped of their civil rights, they lost not only their property, but also their sense of worth and of belonging to this country. Their fortitude during the war and their strength and perseverance after the war allow them to create stability for their families, paving the way for my generation and subsequent generations. For many years, my aunts, uncles, and my parents chose not to speak of this time. They were ashamed and pained by this experience. It was not until the redress movement in the 1980s did the Issei, first generation, and second generation, the Nisei, begin to open up about the war. For many, at first, they always would say, why bring up such bad memories, right? We just want to forget. As the Sansei, or third generation, pursued the telling of their parents' and grandparents' stories, the Issei and Nisei started slowly to share their experiences and the pain they held for so long. The apology from the U.S. government during the Reagan administration to Japanese Americans incarcerated during the war was a step in righting this wrong. The acknowledgement and ability to speak of this history allows us to heal and work toward restoring our faith in our nation. So, in pursuit of this restorative justice and healing, we are deeply grateful to the members of our community who so graciously share their stories and family treasures for our foyer exhibit, The Bitter and Sweet, World War II Stories of Japanese Americans in the West. Karen Bliss, Scott Watanabe, Marsha Takahashi Edwards, and Rod Tatsuno. Longtime members of our community, we know them as teachers, business people, ski instructors, and nonprofit professionals. But because of their willingness to share their stories, we now know them in a different light. And they have brought history to life for us, and in a deeper and richer way. So if you haven't had a chance to stop by the exhibit in the foyer, please be sure to stop by before it closes at the end of March. And today we are honored to have 2 of these community members here, Rod Tatsuno and Marsha Takahashi Edwards, on stage to discuss their families' experiences. We also are honored to have Joan Davies, whose family farmed during the war near the Minidoka War Relocation Center, which is 70 miles south of Sun Valley. Finally, we are pleased to have Mia Russell, Executive Director of Friends of Minidoka, here to facilitate our panel discussion. And the Friends of Minidoka is a nonprofit dedicated to preserving the Minidoka War Relocation Site in partnership with the National Park Service. Additionally, Mia manages the Japanese American Confinement Sites Consortium, a nationwide coalition of preservation, education, and advocacy organizations working to elevate the history and social justice lessons of the World War II experience of Japanese Americans. She also is co-author of Minidoka National Historic Site, published by Images of America. Please welcome Rod, Marsha, Joan, and Mia.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you everyone for being here. And I just want to thank, again, the community library. This all was inspired by a single conversation we had last summer that we just said, hey, we want to start telling the Minidoka story, and we've been blown away by this partnership and this really dedicated programming related to getting this history out here in the Wood River Valley. So really excited to be here and to hear these stories today. So I want to backtrack a little bit. I think with the wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans, a lot of time we compress the timeline from December 7th, 1941 until, late 1945 when the camps closed. But people's stories are much more than that, and they're not neatly bookended in 3 years. So I want to start by asking everyone if you could sort of set the stage of your family kind of arriving and settling in the United States. What was it looking like for the first 2 generations before December 7th? So we'll start with you, Marsha.
Can you hear me? So my family, both my mother and father's side, as Robin said, the Issei, the first generation Japanese. My grandparents on my dad's side came from Nagano, Japan, and my mom's side from Kagoshima, south part of Japan. Ji-chan and Ba-chan Takahashi, my dad's parents, settled in Seattle. And they had one daughter, my oldest aunt, who's 101 now. She was born in Japan as well, so she was actually considered an Issei. And the word Issei and Nisei comes from the Japanese language, ichi, ni, san, 1, 2, 3. So Issei, Nisei is the second generation. Lori and I, and my sister Lori's here, we're sansei, and our nieces and nephews are yonsei. So that's how the word derived. But so my folks, on my grandparents, on my dad's side, settled in Seattle. My mom's family had a very different story. They immigrated to Petersburg, Alaska. And Petersburg was a town of about 1,500 people. Looks like you know Petersburg. Very small town. Fishing village. So both sets of families had laundry. So they were doing, both the mothers, so my Ji-chan and Ba-chans, they both were doing laundry. And then my dad's side, my Ji-chan was a gardener as well. And my mom's dad was a photographer. So because of their different professions and the different locations, they had really, really different internment experiences. And I'll go into that in a little bit. So their experiences were very different. The Nisei, so my dad, my aunts and my uncles, they were really young. Mom was I think she was about 14. My dad was 16. So they were teenagers. And for them, because of their age, again, they had really different experiences than the Issei. So it'll be interesting for me to talk about the two. But they, like every immigrant that comes to this country, Ji-chan and Ba-chan on both sides came for a better life. They came for work. I think they had both planned on going back to Japan after making their fortune, but of course, life takes different turns. And so they ended up becoming, actually, they all became U.S. citizens, very proud U.S. citizens. And so in a bit, I'll talk about their war experience.
Well, let's see. A lot of people in this room know and have seen me over the years. This is my 50th year in Sun Valley. And originally, a buddy of mine had contacted me when I got out of the Army. I knew him from college, ski club at San Jose State. And he said, hey, we're going ski bum to Aspen. Want to go? And we couldn't get housing in Aspen. So, darn it, I ended up here. And what's interesting is that I had no real idea of this place. 1957, my uncle brought me up here on a fishing trip. I mean, all the way up here to Idaho from California. I mean, you got fishing in the Sierras, right? But no, came up here, and I think we stayed at Trail Creek Village, really old Western-looking place. I saw the ice rink for about 10 minutes, didn't get to skate on it. And little did I know I would come back here, and for 9 years I worked the lights for the ice shows and skated on that rink and everything. Anyhow, we went fishing up to Stanley Lake, and there were only 2 other groups there, and it was all gravel roads and everything. And that was my introduction to Idaho. Yeah, and going back to our family, my grandfather on my mother's side, he came from right around the Hiroshima area, and he went to Oakland, California. He first worked on the railroads, and then later started a laundry, hand laundry. And by the time World War II came, he had 100 employees. He lost it all when the war came. My grandfather on my dad's side, his thing was that he was the second son of a small town merchant in Nagano, and he wasn't able to stay there because he wouldn't have any property since he went to his older brother. So he immigrated to San Francisco, and he first worked as a houseboy. And over the years, I've told people that, could be that my grandfather worked for your grandparents, in San Francisco, and I ended up teaching them, their kids, grandkids, on skiing. Anyhow, my grandparents were in San Francisco and Oakland. My folks met at a church conference, and they had what my dad liked to call a ferry boat romance because there was no San Francisco Bay Bridge. So they would go and meet each other. My dad was at Cal Berkeley. He graduated in the business class of 1936, 30 fellow graduates. One of them was the defense secretary I served under, Robert McNamara, who was one of the whiz kids. He later went to Harvard. Dad took over the business that my grandfather had started, a mercantile business, which he immigrated in 1892, started his business in 1902. In 1906, he had to go and relocate, because of a certain disturbance called the 1906 earthquake. If he had stayed with his business on DuPont Street, it would have been a different tune when they had Flower Drum song. It would have been DuPont Street, da 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 da. Instead, it was turned to Grant Avenue after 1906. My grandfather set up a business later in what's now the Japantown section of San Francisco. If you go there, you'll see the tower and everything else. There's a street called Buchanan Street, and that's the street that my father set up the business after we returned from Topaz, Utah. As a little kid, and it's ironic because this week is National Brotherhood of Skiers Week. My first music I heard was go down around the corner to Geary Street, stick my head in to these black juke joints. And so that was my idea of music. My first dog I had was a little puppy that was given to me by a black cobbler who I would go and watch him work his wonders on shoes and whatever, smell, get high on the polishes and stuff like that. And that was my first experience with a dog. In Topaz, for 3 years, I didn't have access to dogs, grass, trees, anything. It was they'd taken this desert land, just scraped it off with bulldozers, and they built the barracks, and that's what you had. It's on my other grandfather's side, my mom's father. He purchased a house, an old Victorian house in Oakland, and I recall visiting it back in the 50s, late 40s, and it was a really neat place, with the little fish scale sighting and the cupolas and all that kind of stuff. Last time I saw it, I remember it was in an area that was later redeveloped, and somebody said that house has moved to somewhere near Jack London Square, so it may still exist. My parents decided to leave San Francisco when my brother died. My older brother spent half his life in Topaz behind barbed wire, and he left us in a tonsillitis operation. And so my folks moved us to San Jose to get away from the memories. The first time I got on skis was when my dad volunteered to drive kids from San Jose State up to the Sierras in the station wagon. Rented me some old ridgetop skis, and that's how I ended up getting on skis for the first time. Little did I know that I would end up having to harass all the people around here on my skis for so many years.
Brad, I think I'm going to stop you there. And
Huh?
I think I'm going to stop you there, and we'll see what Joan's family was up to, and then we'll come back around and talk about
Yeah.
the war period. So, Joan, I know, I don't know what your story was and how your family came to Idaho, but if you could kind of set the stage for us leading up to the war. And
Okay, I will try to do that. I think that Rod and I have a connection here with San Francisco, but that will come out in the story. My maternal side of the family immigrated to the United States in 1884. My maternal grandfather was an Austrian who was an aristocrat and who wanted to be a doctor. And he fell in love with a peasant, and that was not acceptable in that country at that time. So he moved to America and bought a farm in Minnesota, and then had his bride come over, and they were married in Minnesota. So that was my mother's fine. And my mother was a school teacher, and she taught for the Rocky Mountain Teachers Association. And my father, his family came from Wales and settled in the South. My father had done a lot of agriculture, but then went to Barnes Business School and studied how to work in a bank and how to keep books. They both came to a small town in Wyoming within 3 hours of one another, met each other there, and were married. My mother taught school. My father was the banker. Time passed. The bank failed. And they had gotten married, and in those days, if you were married, you didn't teach anymore. So what do you do at that point? My father went to the oil fields and started dressing tools, and my father taught her how to keep books, and she went to Laramie, Wyoming, and kept books in the bank. They didn't like this arrangement, so came to Idaho and bought a farm 11 miles east of the Minidoka camp. And they did that in 1929. And since we're in a library, if any of you have read the book of We Sagebrush Folks by Annie Pike Greenwood, that's our farm. Now, I think there's an interesting thread through here that I'll tell sort of at the end of it. But when the war came, we needed help because everybody had left. And it was the Japanese people that came out to our site, as well as Germans that were incarcerated just to the east of us, and Italians. So that, sort of in a nutshell, is where we were.
yeah, thank you. We'll get more into that story in a moment. So now that we've kind of set the scene, let's fast forward to, the exclusion orders, Pearl Harbor. I'm sure you've heard some reflections of that really sort of disruptive time for everyone at that time. So if you can sort of take us to, what happened and where your family went and what their camp experience was.
Well, as I mentioned, Mom's family was in Petersburg, in a town of 1,500. So the hysteria, the fear, the racism was in a small town was huge. And so my grandfather, as I said, he was a photographer, and so they must have thought he was a spy. They being the city officials, came and arrested him and put him in the town jail. Again, Mom was, I think, around 14. She said, and like Robin said, our family never talked about these incidents. It's just as we got older, we started to tease these stories out of them. So at 14, when Mom saw that her dad was in jail, she had to walk to school, and the jail was in a small house because it was a small town, in the back of a house. And so she saw her dad, and my mom's name was June, and he was calling, Junie, come here, come here. He was waving at her. And Mom said that she was really embarrassed. She didn't know why they had come and arrested him, so she was afraid as well. So she ran the other way so she wouldn't have to see her dad. So then they shipped him down to Lordsburg, New Mexico, where one of the camps was, and she didn't see him again for about 3 years. That after that day, she said she would walk the long way to school so she wouldn't have to see her father. And Mom passed away about 2 years ago, or just a year ago. And I know that was one of the biggest regrets that she's had in her life, is that she was never able to tell her dad, never able to apologize, never able to tell him how much she loved him or how sorry she was for that. So, the scars were lasting. After they took the men from the jail in Petersburg and shipped them down to the lower 48, then, for whatever reason, they came and they arrested the adult women. So my grandmother, Bachan Oyama, and then my mom had an older sister who was an adult at the time. So her older sister as well, the officers came to the house again, and the house next door, and they arrested all the adult women. So Mom, she was a scared little girl. So she had her little cousin to take care of. The little boy next door, Frankie Kino, I think he was about 7 years old, and then 3 other kids from the Osawa family. So she had 5 little kids to take care of. She didn't know how to cook. She didn't know how to clean. She went to the neighbors. The neighbors wouldn't help her. So I can just imagine the fear that went through her mind. And I know that shaped, again, another incident that shaped her for the rest of her life. The adult women, they weren't in jail all that long, about 2 weeks. And then they came back, and then they had to pack whatever they could carry. They put them on the ship, and the ship brought them down to the Seattle area, to the Assembly Center in Puyallup, before shipping them off to Minidoka. So she was reunited with her mother and then her her sister. But, even to this day, when Mom talked about it, she couldn't talk about it without crying. So it was just a scar on her life. On my dad's side, they had a more, quote, normal evacuation. They were in Seattle. So they took the Japanese families, and the first place they put them, they called them assembly centers. So it was the Puyallup Fairgrounds. And the camps here at Minidoka, or all the other camps, they weren't ready yet. So they put them in assembly centers while the camps were being built. The assembly centers, they were living in horse stalls. So someone the other day we were talking with said that they can still remember the smell of the manure and the horse urine. And so they had to live there for a few months. My dad, as I said, he was about 16 years old. So he volunteered to go over to Minidoka early to help build the camps. And so they helped build the barracks, and a lot of the young men did this. Eventually, from the assembly camps, they put the families on trains. They blacked out the windows of the trains so the people wouldn't know where they were going. And they put them on the trains, and they sent them over to Minidoka. But while the families were in camp, that's where my mom and dad met each other. So they started a teenage romance back then. The families both were shipped to Minidoka, and they lived in, I can't remember what blocks, but they lived for the next few years in the camps. Do you want me to go in and tell further about Dad's wartime experience, or do you want to wait on that?
Let's wait, yeah.
Okay, so they were teenagers growing up. So as I said, the teenagers there, they actually had a pretty good time. They had the adults that Issei tried to make as normal of a life as possible for them. So they had the schools there. The schools had dances. They had a band. They had baseball teams. So the kids actually had a pretty good time there. They were young. And then eventually, as Joan said, the farms needed work there. So, and we'll talk about this in a bit, but they signed a pledge, a loyalty pledge to the United States. Once they did that, they were able to get out and go work on the farm. So all the kids worked on the farms locally and then would come back to camp at night. But it was really, I think, the Issei who I think, and unfortunately couldn't talk with Jichan and Bachan either, Oyama or the Takahashi side, very well, because they spoke Japanese and we didn't. But for them, I mean, having your livelihood taken away from you kind of at the prime of your life, the boredom, not knowing where you're going, what's happening to you, and then coming to a place where you're surrounded by, first of all, you're taken away by guards with guns, surrounded by barbed wire with a guard tower. Now in retrospect, I wish I had the opportunity to talk with them about their experiences. I'm sure it would have been harrowing, but I would love to have known what was going on in their heads.
Thanks. Well, Red, I think it was after the war that you came into the picture. So what was your family, where were they sent immediately, and then where did they spend kind of the duration?
Okay. My dad had graduated from Cal Berkeley. My folks got married in 1938. What's interesting is when they celebrated their 50th anniversary, they went back to the Grand Canyon. And as they strolled along this overlook, they met another couple, and my dad just had to go and say hi to them and introduce themselves. And it turned out that the couple had been married on the same day in 1938. So they went out to dinner together. And so that's just kind of a side story, but you think they survived through all the things that happened for that 50 years. Anyhow, my dad had to close up the store that my grandfather had started. And there's a famous picture of him with a sign, evacuation sale, with my older brother standing there, who was about 2.5 years old. And Dorothea Lange, the famous life photographer, took that picture along with others. There's one of me with my mom in this kitchen in our house in San Francisco. But I was kind of a standby there, sort of, because I wasn't born yet before we went to the camps. The reason that Dorothy took pictures of our family was that her husband, Paul, was my dad's economics professor at Cal Berkeley. So it's kind of these little interconnections. The family house was already bought and paid for, so we didn't lose that. A lot of the personal items were stored. The government allowed people to go and store things. As a couple had gone and rented the house to live in, and when my dad got to get out to check on things after a month at Tanforan, he found that they had were using the car, things like that, so they had to go and contact authorities and put a stop to that, whatever. In Tanforan, which was a racetrack, most people had never heard of it until the movie Seabiscuit came out. And that's where Seabiscuit was trained and quartered. I was born in the middle of the racetrack there in the end of May 1942. And my grandfather used to go and take me out on the racetrack in a little old pram. And so probably a few people say that I covered the same ground as Seabiscuit, but not under my own power. We were there for a few months. I was told that I was a good baby because I didn't wake the people in the next stalls. I love the smell of horses and whatever inherently to this day. And it was later at a Y camp that I actually got to go and be a wrangler for summer and take kids and show them what it's like to be next to a real horse compared to something they saw on TV. Anyhow, we were there for a few months, and then they moved us, as Marsha said, by train with covered windows to Topaz, Utah, which is south central Utah. It's just the north side of what they call the Red Rock country, where everyone likes to go and mountain bike. But in that particular section, it's just a very, very flat area, desert, scrub bushes, and whatever. When they built the camps, they just bulldogged off everything. So my first memories when I was 2-3 years old, which you don't have that many memories of things, but I can remember that desolateness, the dust. It's interesting that I think back about it. when I was in the Army, eating the old mess hall, World War II barracks and everything else, there was kind of a familiarity there because of having lived in the barracks in Topaz. So I was used to that, the trains all lined up with no partitions between them, mass showers. That's what we did in basic. Anyhow, when we were there in Topaz, my grandfather, I didn't realize now, Jesus, when we got out of there, he was younger than I am now. I recall, it seems like he was older. A lot of the East Bay seemed older. I don't know about you with your grandparents or whatever, but it seems like people went through a harder life in the past. And so you look at it now and think, wow, could I have existed at that age, my age now, then? How would it have been? Now, everyone, had to leave what they were used to. It would be like if you took this area, we got a very disparate group of people. We got people in these $10 million, $15 million houses, and you have the rest of us that live in a little less lavish circumstances. If you took everyone and all of a sudden had to go and live in the same place under the same conditions, in a way is kind of an equalizer. People that were educated, like my dad, put in with people that were farmers that were, second generation, never really gone beyond high school. That was a different thing. When I was in the Army, I was what's called a platoon guide. And out of our complement of about 360 guys, there were maybe 5 of us were college graduates. And so they tended to go and pick college graduates and then people that had gone and passed the test for officer candidate school. And so that was interesting that you had that. But getting back to the camps again, my parents decided to revisit the first time in 1955, 10 years later. And it was interesting to see this place. And there was a feeling of, that feeling back in your mind that you've been there, experienced something, but you couldn't quite really get into the full, idea of what it was about. The last time I took my parents there, I drove down to California, drove them in their RV to Topaz, and here we had a drought year, and it was raining. And we camped in the RV just outside the gate and had some lunch, and I saw a couple drive up, and when they got out, they were looking at the plaque for the camp. I noticed that one of his sleeves was pinned up. So I went out there and I said, excuse me, but are you 442nd? And he said, yes. He lost his arm in Italy. And some of these things that they have from the Center in Japanese American Museum in L.A., they have pictures of him with the pinned up sleeve. Anyhow, the camp, the flag over the monument was hanging at half staff. It was 9/11, 2002. Anyhow, the experience there was interesting just because who would have thought that you would have something like that happen here and then to be a part of it. I was too young to really realize and remember all the things, like George Takei has been, interviewed, and he's gone and said things about how it was because he was 7 years old when he was first interned. And so he had more of the experience. As Marsha says, the teenagers enjoyed it because they could get thrown together and be able to do a lot of activities that they couldn't do because their parents were in the old country, were stricter, didn't allow certain things, and all of a sudden now they could go and do all this stuff. So it was a kind of a dual thing happening. You know, just there were good things, but there were, you know, negative things. Negative thing would be that picture if you had to go and be told that, you know, you have 7 days to go and take care of all your businesses. If you own a car and you have to go and have payments on it, you're going to lose your car because you can't pay it. If you have a mortgage, you can't pay the mortgage. If you have a dog, which a lot of us could relate to that, you had to go and let your dog go. There are cases of people shooting their dogs rather than just leave them on their own. And that when I think about that, that really gets to me because I've been a dog person all my life. There's a lot of things there that, you know, are connected with this. When we came back to San Francisco, I recall that when I was at preschool, elementary school, it was called Raphael Whale Elementary School. And I was spit on, kicked by kids, punched, whatever, called names. And the ironic thing was the kids were black. And they were the children of people that had moved up from the South for the war jobs and the shipyards and everything. And they had no clue what it was really like out beyond where they were because they had moved into the area that had been the San Francisco Japanese community, and it turned into more blacks being there. So that's interesting too, sociologically, about what happened. That's why I've always felt kind of it's an odd thing. Well, I'll get back to that too, that the harassment I got ended when this big black kid stepped me on his shoulders, paraded me on the yard and said, anyone lay a finger on my friend and you're going to answer it to me. And after that, it stopped. Ironically, moved to San Jose, then I got to go equal opportunity discrimination from white kids. I'm trying to think of something else.
Well, I think you kind of gave us a good view of the bitter and the sweet
Yeah.
a little bit. So I think now I want to hear from Joan. With your family had a really unique connection to Minidoka during the war. So do you want to tell us what that was all about?
Yes, get this green light on. Well, I'm about the same age as you are, Rod, and I was born in San Francisco, and that's because my grandfather or great-grandfather, who did not become a doctor, raised two sons who became doctors, and they were in San Francisco. So those were where we were. There were new people. We were out on the sagebrush. We were out in volcanic ash, which was very sort of glue kind of soil, particularly if it was rain. It was light, dusty. So that is the environment in Idaho was the same way as it was in Topaz. But we were on the Greenwood Farm, which my father used to call it the 40 Plum Ranch. And 40 plum meant it was 40 miles from nowhere, and it was plumb out in the sticks. So that was sort of true, a little bit stretched. But the camp was 11 miles from the farm, and the war was ensuing, and there was no labor. And one of the best stories that I can tell, I think, is the role that carrot seed played in agriculture in Idaho during that time. Well, all over, because it was being subsidized by the government because they were wanting carrots to get the vitamin A out of it to feed to pilots so that they had night vision. And so the crop was very lucrative, but it's also very, very labor intensive. And I had a picture, but anyway, it may come back to me one time, of Japanese on the back of a flat platform, and it's being pulled by horses, and they are sticking the tubers into the ground so that they can come up and raise the seed for the next year, because it's a 2-year kind of thing, but very labor intensive. The second year, we have pictures of where they were picking. They have, similar to what some of those who have picked potatoes, there was carrot seed, and they would take that great big blossom and put them into the sacks, and then they were dried. My father had a car, and he could get 6 people in the car. Well, if he drove, it was a 22-mile trip to and fro, and he only got 5 laborers. And he realized that if he didn't drive the car, it was only an 11-mile trip, and he didn't have to drive back and forth and make it 44 by that time. And he got an extra laborer. So he contacted the person that was in charge of the camp and convinced them to let them loan the car to the people that were coming to the farm. And it happened. So there was a wonderful relationship that I think was being built that I don't think people realize. The Japanese, everybody was fearful, and I love the part in the book of Bitter and Sweet of where they're first realizing how that fear was, and it must have been just gut-wrenching. But they came. My mother fed them meals because sometimes they were there early in the morning. They got 3 meals a day there. And one of the people that came to the farm and worked on us is George Nagashima. And if there is a book on the back, or I have a book here, and he went to Hope. He was later on sponsored out of the camp by a French architect and ended up in Hope. He has done beautiful works, altars in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And on Antique Roadshow the other day, somebody picked up a chair for $23, and it was almost $32,000 that it was valued at, because it was a Nagashima chair. George had a daughter, Myra, who is the same age as we are, within a month or so. And so I knew George when I didn't know him because he was so small. I was so small. But it was a wonderful family experience. Later on, my brother, who was an architect, do you want me to tell the story of the? Please. Later on, my brother was the chairman of the Idaho AIA, and was sponsoring a convention at Sun Valley, and thought it would be wonderful to ask George Nagashima to come out and address the group. He had that all arranged. George, he asked him what kind of a stipend he would like to have. George had one request: pay for my airfare and take me back to the camp. George didn't ever get here, and he died before that event happened. But my brother was so very moved by this whole thing that my brother has built 2 Japanese gardens elsewhere, but also shepherded the project of putting up the honor roll for all of what's the number? 442. I'm sorry, my memory's leaving me. Anyway, back to the relationships of those people. Everywhere you go, if I'm at something and working with this project in some way, you always meet someone. And at the opening the other day, there was a woman who came up and said, my maiden name was Vaughn. And she said, I want to meet one of the Vaughn family members. And another man who knew me brought her over to me. And her family, who she is now in near Seattle, when they left the camp, they went to another farm in the area and lived in a cottage just south of Eden at the Shaver Ranch. And my brother, same person who did the honor roll later, was 14 years of age at that time, as so was she. And we were still needing help. And that family then came from the Shaver Ranch and came back out to our place and helped us out. And I can't believe the ties that are still there in memories of people. And it was people helping people. And what a nice model it is for, we should be doing more of that today. Is that enough?
Joan. Yeah, that's great. I want to leave room for questions, but I just real quickly want to ask Marsha to mention her father's service, because I think we've had a few mentions of the 442, and if you don't all know, about the 442, then if Marsha could just mention it.
The 442nd was an all Japanese American regime. It's the most decorated military regime in the history of the military. And so out in front, we have displayed is my dad's Congressional Medal of Honor. He never talked, well, like Robin said, they just never talked about camp. And then when Kenny and I were married, Kenny asked a lot of questions, and he had a really special bond with my dad. He kind of a guy bond, but he got a lot of stories from my dad about war that I never knew. And to this day, Kenny says, your dad was a hero. You never knew that, but he was a hero. And one of the stories that he told Kenny, he was in, well, first of all, he was in camp, and they came, and they recruited young men out of camp. And knowing my dad, he didn't really want to go, but of course the Issei said, you have to go. You've got to prove that you're American. So Minidoka had the most men in the 442nd. Isn't that right, from any of the camps? The first inductees. Thank you, Hanako. So he was an infantryman in the 442. He fought in the Gothic Line battle, and one of the stories that he told Kenny was that there was a German troop up on Mount Folgorito, and they couldn't. The other American troops couldn't attack them or couldn't capture them, so they called on the 442nd to do it, and they devised a plan where the men would hike up just a sheer cliff. And so it was at night. They started out in the night, in the dark, and they were told that you can't make any noise. We don't want the Germans to know, of course, they were coming. And one of the fellows that was next to Dad fell, and of course fell to his death. But he didn't want to scream, and so as he fell, Dad saw him holding his mouth to his death. They were successful. They captured the Germans. The Germans were surprised. But again, Dad just never talked about his war experiences. But later on in life, as adults, he was so excited and so proud to learn that that his troop was earning the Congressional Medal of Honor. So back in 2011, Kenny, Mom and Dad, Kenny and me, and my niece and nephew went back to watch the ceremony, and that was one of the proudest moments of his life. It was so moving, and he died shortly after that, and I think that was one of the reasons why he stayed alive. He really was looking forward to getting that. But his experience as a young man was going to war, coming back, having to take the parents after the war was over left camp, but they never complained. They never were bitter, never talked about it. We had a family friend. I talked earlier about a loyalty oath. They asked the Japanese in camp to sign a loyalty oath, and there were 3 questions. Would you give up your allegiance to Japan? Would you fight for America? Mm-hmm. And what was the third?
Those are the 2 main.
Oh, the 2.
Yeah.
And so you answered yes and yes. And if you passed the loyalty test, obviously the kids got to leave camp early. Like my mom and my aunts went out and worked in the factories on the East Coast. For the men, they could enlist. One of our family friends was what they called a no-no boy. He answered no. He wouldn't swear allegiance to America, and no, he wouldn't fight. And those men were ostracized by the Japanese community for years and years and years. Actually, just at the last JACL convention, they finally issued a apology proclamation, but it was still divisive. But before Dad died, this family friend Katz, they never talked again about the war at all, but Dad told me, he goes, I wish I would have talked to Katz about his no-no boy experience. He said it took more courage for him to do that than to fight in the war. So just the divisiveness, the guilt and the shame, carried through so many stories. I want to tell just one last story. Some of you know Yosh Nakagawa. He is a old Seattle friend. He's about 94 now, something like that. Yeah, yes, young 89. I told him that we were doing this panel discussion. He says, I want you to tell all the people there, thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, for our family this opportunity. He said, I left camp with nothing, and he worked his way up and became the owner of one of the most prestigious sports stores in the Seattle area called Osborne and Ullin. When Yosh was in camp, a young boy in camp, he was, our family was members of the Japanese Baptist Church, and one of the ministers at Japanese Baptist was a Caucasian man, Reverend Andy, and he came to minister to his people. He couldn't live in the camps, so he lived in Twin Falls, and his family were the subjects of terrible racism because they were white helping the enemies. But Reverend Andy ministered to the kids, the families there, and so Yosh and a bunch of kids wanted to get baptized. So Reverend Andy tried to arrange the baptism in the local Baptist churches, and none of them would allow them to bring the Japanese kids to the church. So he somehow transported them in a bus or something up to Cathedral Pines. In an army truck. So Yosh remembers driving past Sun Valley thinking, God, that looks like a really great place. And they said, well, you can't go there. They'll shoot you because it was Japanese. But they went up and they were baptized up at Hot Springs Cathedral Pines. And he wanted to tell you thank you because now, as the former owner of Osborne and Ullin, he has been treated so well by so many of the ski people here and the sports industry here in the Sun Valley. So, thank you.
So
Yosh is a real dreamer. And I want to tell the dream story, but at the end.
well, I was going to open it up to questions now, so. Yeah, go, yeah.
Tell us the dream story.
It's good news.
Does anyone have any questions?
Tell us the dream story.
No, please.
Well, it's sort of it's more of the family, which it just surprises me, is because my uncle or my brother was an architect. I have 3 sons, and 2 of them are engineers. One of them is an engineer in Seattle, structural, civil. And the other day, he bought the Greenwood Farm 2 years ago. That's the farm that everybody came and helped and did a lot of things on the other ones. And I think he has been influenced by his uncle on the projects that he has done and the stories that he has heard. And I could bring other artifacts out of here if we wanted to. But the Panama Hotel owner, Jan Johnson, and a civil engineer in Seattle with a love for a farm who has a barrack on it and has just had all the windows reglazed and refinished it. And everybody says, why are you doing it? And it's because it has history attached to it, I think. But they're thinking about, the owner wants to see what they can do to create a museum in the bottom of the Panama Hotel.
Which is the one in the hotel in the corner of Bitter and Sweet. Thank you. And so with that, I think we'll open the floor for questions for our panelists. And Hanako in the back will be running a mic for us. But first, let's give them a big thank you. And really, this is just a tiny glimpse. I know there's so many stories they haven't been able to tell, so please.
We could keep you here all night, huh?
Molly? Oh,
Oh, do I?
yeah.
This is a question, I guess, for Marsha or Rod, but how were you able to get your parents to start talking about Minidoka and their experiences?
Well, I remember as a kid asking Mom and Dad about it, and one of the things they used to say is, well, one thing I asked is, why didn't you protest or why didn't you do as you were being taken away? And my dad would say, well, you have to understand, it was a different time. They had guns, we didn't. And then he said, "Shigata ganai means, and there was nothing we could do about it. So they just accepted it.
Then how did you, later in life, how did you get their stories?
When did they start talking?
They started to, as they got older. I think, your mortality comes to life as you get older. And and me becoming more educated about it too, we asked them more. And so slowly they started telling stories. This is primarily after redress. And then especially as Dad got older, and we found out about the Congressional Medal of Honor, he started talking more about his experiences. So I wish, I would have asked more questions. It's too late now, but I wish we would have.
And Rod, we didn't even mention your dad's video. Do you want to mention that folks can see it in the Regional History Museum, and then just tell us a little bit about what that is?
Say about what?
The video, your dad's video?
Oh. Well, my dad, in the mid-30s, lost a good friend of his, one of his best friends. And somebody showed him a movie of his friend Shikoba walking and talking and smiling. Dad thought, my God, Shig is still kind of alive. And that turned him on to taking movies. He had a wind-up 8mm Bell & Howell camera, and he would take pictures of everything. One scene I remember he has is some parade in San Francisco that shows Japanese sailors in their white outfits and the Hinomaru battle flags flying. And Dad had said he'd gone and written some sort of article thing, or in some class in Cal, about how there would never be war between the U.S. and Japan. And he'd tell that like, oh my God, boy, he wasn't a very good fortune teller. Anyhow, he got into the movie 8mm film, home movies, and when he was at Topaz, he couldn't. Everyone had to go and turn in their cameras, weapons, whatever. He gave it to a friend of his to hold for him because they didn't know what was going to happen. People were saying, send him back to Japan, kill him, whatever else. So while he was in the camp, the assistant director, a man named Walter Hondrick, was taking movies of his children. And Dad was just going, geez, I wish I had my camera. And Walter asked him, well, where is it? He said, well, it's with a friend in San Francisco. He says, have him send it to me, which the friend did. Okay, so now you have a camera, but what do you do with the camera? You didn't have to worry about batteries with it. You can wind it up, but what about film? Well, my dad was the general manager of the cooperative store since his background was retail, and he had a business degree from Cal. So he would go and take these trips back east or Midwest to get merchandise to sell in the store. You couldn't get things. It was hard to get. So he would go stop by in Chicago, the Bass Camera Shop, and pick up film. And then he would go and mostly they were home movies, our birthdays, or just doing things. He would take some shots. Like one scene, he takes it from up high on top of a barracks building, and you can kind of see Sentry Towers in the distance. But obviously, he couldn't go right near the barbed wire or the towers. And then I thought, well, gee, what about you have this film? What'd you do with it? How'd you develop? He said he sent it back east, and can you imagine they actually processed it, and no one questioned it. There were these barracks and all the things in the background. Like, it's not your usual fishing trip, something. And then eventually he was able to go, and when things lightened up, he was able to get a projector sent from his friend, and he could go and show the movies, replay them in the camps. Now, what's interesting, in some of the shots, there's one couple in particular, Henry and Rose Taney, that are shown there. they had moved to Minneapolis after they got out of the camps. While Rose was actually, while her son was up in the shuttle, Rose died in a car-train collision, and the son could not attend the funeral or the memorial service. So there's a connection there. So if you look at that film, there's this couple very prominently, the Tawneys were there. There's other connections with the film, like this one scene of a woman skating on an ice rink was taken at Topaz on a homemade rink, and that appeared in the movie Snowfall on Cedars. You know, it was supposed to be in Wyoming, but it was actually in Topaz, and that woman was half Italian, half Japanese. And at the time, if you're 1/16th, you went to the camps. So that shows kind of the little connections there with his film. In 1989, my dad's film Topaz, a combined thing they put together, was nominated into the National Film Library of the Library of Congress. And the only other home movie in that library is the JFK's Zapruder assassination film. So it kind of puts it up there. My dad says, geez, look what that thing could go for. Dad always had the humor.
I encourage everyone to go check it out
Yeah.
because it's actually
Now,
in color.
Getting back to the thing about what did my parents feel about it. Dad always had a good outlook on the experience. He said, yeah, it was tough and everything else. And I often wondered, God, he was 29 years old when I was born, and there, and how he could go and have that attitude about it. Back in the 50s and 60s, he went on speaking engagements for the YMCA. He was on the board of the San Jose Y. I didn't realize at home he'd have these people over for dinner, and he would go and cook up the skiaki at his table. My mom had gone to done the shopping, the prep, and everything else, and I had to do the dishes afterwards. Little dish here and dish, teacup, blah, blah, blah. And he would just do this thing. And the guests we had were, like CEOs of IBM and Lockheed and you name it. And I had no clue that, it's out of the ordinary. How would you know these people? And my dad would talk about his experiences in the camps and try to explain what it was about. So his attitude was different. And we grew up with that we didn't see it as a real negative. It's more of a positive thing. In my dad's film, he talks about, better to light a candle than curse darkness. So.
Thank you. Another question there.
Joan, the workers at your parents' farm, did they make a wage or were they strictly volunteering to get out of camp?
It was a small wage. Do you remember what the actual amount was?
Well, it depended on, I guess, the farmers, but most of it was still below what white employees would make. But it was more than camp, which camp was $16 a month. But that's for more higher-end jobs. Most people made between $10 and $12 in camp. So a lot of people can make sometimes 25 cents an hour, 35 cents an hour outside of camp if they're working in the field. So that's a lot more money that they can make. And then I saw a hand back there. Okay.
Have there been any outreach or discussions with any of the guards from these camps?
Not at Minidoka. I've actually been trying to research that for a few years now, and I found through the Twin Falls Times newspaper articles where they would have just articles of the USO in town where the soldiers would be hanging out with the women in town. And all I've been able to find was that it was a National Guard troop from Detroit, from Michigan, that initially came out. And then they got called out, and then I don't know who came in, and I I kind of hit a dead end with my research, so I think I need to go to Michigan. But I haven't heard any at other camps. I think maybe at Manzanar they've got a few oral histories with them, but as far as Minidoka, we don't. And even with folks like Joan, any folks around town, like we still run into folks that say, "Oh, my mom taught at camp," or "My uncle was helping construct it," and we are so interested in those stories as well. That that really tell the whole story. So if you know of anyone with those connections, send them our way. Okay, well, I think if there's no more...
I think one more thing. I don't think people realize that after 45, I think the world decided, or the government decided, that there was a mistake there, and the camp disappeared, literally. It was then given, there was 33,000 acres, and they were divided up into farms that were then on a lottery system given to veterans. And so the farm that the camp is on was the Hermans. And in 1952, when I was 10, I remember being out there, the radio, it was the biggest promotion for agriculture in 1952 that there was that year, and they did a farm in a day. They built the house, which is now the office out there on the site, and quite a story.
But
They
you
had
have to
it planted.
remember. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Anyway.
But the lottery was open only to the Caucasian War veterans.
The laundry?
The lottery.
Oh, the lottery. See, there's another. But that's what happened. And I guess the camp disappeared. And I hear a lot of people in southern Idaho that have never heard of the camp or didn't know of it. And I'm wondering, why did I know it? And it's because I went to that little dilapidated Greenwood school, and the barracks came to be outbuildings there. So we knew where they came from. Then they came to our farm to be outbuildings for other people to live in and labor, and they were slightly fixed up, and barns. And there's a book written that shows where the biggest share of these, and I know where a lot of those barracks are. They're everything from things that are totally dilapidated to business offices to homes for the nurses over next to the Twin Falls Hospital. Anyway, there's stories that go on and on. But I think the real story that I haven't heard yet is we have an executive director in the Friends of Minidoka and the National Park Service and Hanukkah who have put something, if you haven't been down there, you need to go see it because it tells you the story.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you. Yeah, please come out and visit us. All right, one more question.
I wonder, I visited Japan. I love Japanese people. And I visited the Zen monastery there. I know Japan has two, what I call here and now faiths, both Zen Buddhism and Shinto. And I wonder if there's any retaining of the Shinto religion in the camps. I grew up in the Columbia Basin, Washington. I had a Japanese girlfriend for a time. Later, she committed suicide. But I wonder about how they maintain the Shinto or Zen Buddhist tradition.
Sure, I can speak a little bit about Buddhism in camp, or religion in camp, but Shintoism was actually explicitly not allowed to be practiced because there were ties to the emperor. And so that was explicitly not allowed during the incarceration. But at the camps there were a federated Christian church. They sort of made a non-denominational church for all the Christians. And they had, similar with the Buddhist church, they kind of combined everything into one Buddhist church. And then there was also a Catholic church. And so there was still religious practice, and I've heard some stories about folks doing other more obscure religious practices, but Shintoism was explicitly not allowed. And I think we'll wrap it up now. And of course, I'm sure our panelists are happy to talk to you more afterwards. But thank you all for your attention, and thanks for coming.